She was found slumped in the back seat of a Renault 5, parked on a quiet street in Paris. The windows were shut. The summer heat had turned the car into a tomb. Her body had been there for days, bloated, unrecognizable. A bottle of barbiturates. A farewell note. Officially, it was suicide. But Jean Seberg wasn't just another Hollywood tragedy. She was the face of a revolution in cinema, and the face of rebellion in real life. The FBI had followed her for years. She had dared to support the Black Panthers, to challenge white America, to speak out when silence was safer. They smeared her. They watched her. They waited for her to fall. At 40, she was broken. Not by fame. Not by failure. But by a system that decided she was dangerous the moment she stopped being their darling. This is the untold story of Jean Seberg. She entered the scene like a comet. Blonde pixie cut, American accent wrapped in French irony, and a stare that never blinked. Jean Seberg wasn't just an actress, she was a contradiction. Too European for Hollywood. Too American for Paris. And yet, somehow, she belonged to both. At just 18, she became a global headline, an unknown teenager from Iowa cast as Joan of Arc by the infamous Otto Preminger, plucked from obscurity after beating out 18,000 hopefuls in a nationwide search. It was a fairy tale on paper. But St. Joan, 1957, was a disaster. Critics attacked her performance with cruelty that bordered on violence. Wooden, they said. Miscast. The public humiliation was relentless. For most, it would have ended there. But Jean was never made of glass. In Bonjour Tristesse, 1958, she returned softer, wiser, quieter. The camera caught something else, a haunting presence. She was no longer playing icons, she was becoming one. Then came Breathless, 1960. And with it, immortality. Wearing a striped t-shirt, selling the New York Herald Tribune on the Champs-Élysées, Jean redefined what it meant to be modern. Her Patricia Franchini was effortless, ambivalent, flirtatious, tragic. She wasn't acting. She was living in real time, in between Goddard's improvisational camera movements and jump cuts. She didn't chase stardom, it lingered behind her like a shadow. Breathless launched the French New Wave. And it crowned Jean Seberg its muse. Suddenly, she was everywhere. Vogue called her the face of Paris. Life magazine dubbed her the most interesting American in Europe. Designers mimicked her minimalist style. Women cut their hair short to match. Men fell for the quiet defiance in her eyes. But unlike other starlets of her time, Jean didn't play by the rules. She wasn't seduced by Hollywood's glamour. She moved freely between continents, between languages, between genres. In Lilith, 1964, she played a schizophrenic in a sanitarium opposite Warren Beatty. A performance so raw, so unfiltered, it felt like a confession. She called it her favorite film, perhaps because it was the closest thing to truth. Jean was more than beautiful. She was magnetic. Not in the curated, polished way the studios preferred, but in the way storms are magnetic. Unpredictable. Electric. Always carrying the scent of something dangerous. She made over 30 films across 2 continents, working with legendary directors and opposite major stars. But what defined her wasn't box office numbers or awards. It was presence. That unmistakable sense that something was brewing beneath the surface, a smile that seemed rehearsed but wasn't. A laugh that died too quickly. And yet, despite the fame, despite the fashion spreads and the premieres, Jean Seberg never looked entirely comfortable in the spotlight. There was always a distance, as if part of her remained elsewhere, behind a locked door. Reporters asked about her style. Her romances. Her European charm. No one asked what it felt like to be devoured by 2 cultures and never fully embraced by either. As one critic once wrote, she moved through scenes like someone searching for the exit. To the public, Jean was elegance without effort. Intelligence without arrogance. A rare bloom that refused to be pruned. But they only saw what the lens allowed. The real Jean Seberg, the one behind the magazine covers and press junkets, was already slipping through the cracks. Before the cameras, before the French headlines and FBI files, there was Marshalltown. A flat, windswept town in Iowa, the kind of place where everyone knows your last name and no one expects you to leave. Jean Dorothy Seberg was born into modestness. Her father, Edward, was a pharmacist with quiet Scandinavian pride. Her mother, Dorothy Arlene, was a substitute teacher with English-German roots and a sharp eye for perfection. They raised 4 children in a white wooden house with a big front porch and very small dreams. The Sebergs believed in discipline, community, and hard work, not stardom, not Paris. Jean, even as a child, didn't quite belong. She was restless. Curious. A girl who read too many books, stared too long out the window, and asked questions no one knew how to answer. She was always somewhere else, her younger brother once said. That elsewhere became her first stage. At school, Jean wasn't the most popular girl, but she carried an air of distance. As though she knew something her classmates didn't. She joined drama club, read Brando's lines aloud in her bedroom mirror, and daydreamed about movies she'd never seen. At 16, she wrote a fan letter to Marlon Brando, not as a fan, but as an equal, inviting him to stay with her family if he was ever in Iowa. He never answered. But years later, when they finally met in Hollywood, he remembered the letter, and joked about the offer. Jean didn't laugh. She wasn't joking. There was a fire under her quiet exterior, a hunger not just for acting, but for escape. Iowa was too small. The expectations too low. She wanted to be someone else. Somewhere else. And so, at 17, when Otto Preminger launched a nationwide search for a fresh face to play Joan of Arc, Jean saw it as more than a contest. She saw it as a door. She beat 18,000 girls to get the part. But the price came fast. On set, she was untrained, insecure, and overwhelmed. Preminger, a notorious perfectionist, humiliated her in front of the crew. Yelled. Pushed. Reshot scenes until her voice cracked. In one infamous moment, he insisted she endure actual flames for a burning-at-the-stake scene, a method decision that left her with physical burns and emotional ones that would never fade. When St. Joan flopped, the critics didn't spare her. Headlines mocked her wooden performance. Pundits labeled her the wrong girl for the right part. She was 18, publicly crucified, and utterly alone. Her parents didn't understand the pressure. Hollywood didn't offer comfort. And Jean, ever composed in front of the press, began to split behind closed doors. She found herself in Europe, drifting between film sets and hotel rooms, seeking purpose in art-house cinema and unsuitable relationships. Her marriage to François Moruel was brief and strained. She once confessed that she married him because he knew how to order wine, and how to leave a calling card. Ridiculous reasons, she later said. But it wasn't about him. It was about her need for identity, any identity. Despite the fame that followed Breathless, Jean never quite mended the fracture from St. Joan. That first brutal taste of failure planted seeds of doubt she never fully uprooted. She struggled with insomnia. Took sleeping pills. Smoked too much. Drank quietly. Smiled often. She began to mistrust people who were nice to her, convinced they hated her deep down. Happens all the time in Hollywood, she once told a friend. There were other wounds she never spoke of. Rumors swirled for years about a controlling mother, an emotionally distant father, and a childhood where emotions were tidy but love was conditional. Jean never confirmed them. She rarely spoke of Iowa at all. Only in rare moments, between takes, in diary scraps, did the small-town girl re-emerge. One of her most repeated lines was this: "I know that the greatest of actresses has about 20 good years of acting in her, and that she will go on living for 30 or 40 years as a human being." It wasn't cynicism. It was prophecy. Jean Seberg had a gift for disappearing into characters, into cities, into lovers. But she never quite found herself. And long before her enemies came for her, the FBI, the press, the whispers, she was already fractured. Not broken, but close. She didn't rise. She was sculpted, by the men who cast her, the critics who crushed her, and the world that never allowed her to be simple. Jean Seberg wasn't a reinvention in the glamorous sense. She didn't dye her hair or hire a new agent. Her transformation was something quieter. Deeper. Like erosion, invisible at first, but irreversible. After the collapse of St. Joan, the studio wanted her to lie low. But Jean didn't retreat. She crossed an ocean. In France, she found not just new roles but new definitions. The American press saw her as a failure. The French saw her as a blank slate, untainted, unfinished, and full of potential. And so, they built her. Godard gave her freedom. Not lines to memorize, but emotions to follow. He didn't want perfection, he wanted real time, real tension. In Breathless, Jean didn't act so much as exist. Improvised. Smoked. Looked into the camera like it owed her an apology. Paris didn't just embrace her, it devoured her. But with reinvention came compromise. Jean became the American in Paris, but not the one Hemingway wrote about. She became a symbol of modern femininity, strong but seductive, foreign but familiar. Her style was studied. Her walk mimicked. Her accent analyzed. Even her silences became performance. She played the game, for a while. She married François Mauruel, a French lawyer and aspiring filmmaker. Their union was intellectual, cinematic, and doomed. She admitted later she married him for ridiculous reasons, because he knew how to order wine and behave in restaurants. But beneath the sarcasm was something darker. She was crafting an identity she didn't fully believe in. When that marriage ended, she fell into another, this time with literary giant Romain Gary. He was older, revered, and as emotionally complex as she was fragile. With Gary, she tried to be more than an actress. She wanted to be a wife, a mother, a thinker. They had a son, Diego. For a brief moment, it looked like she had built a new life, something grounded, European, un-Hollywood. But the cracks followed her across continents. In public, she was still the muse. In private, she was unraveling. She started taking sleeping pills more frequently. Not to escape, to rest. Just to rest. "I don't want to be perfect," she told a friend. "I just want to breathe." Still, she continued to work, in Lilith, 1964, where she played a woman slipping into madness with haunting accuracy. She later called it her favorite role. Perhaps because she didn't have to pretend. The world admired her for the same reasons it misunderstood her. They called her ethereal. Mysterious. But they missed the truth. Jean didn't want to be untouchable. She wanted to be real. Seen. Heard. By the late 1960s, something in her shifted. She became politically active, fiercely so. At a time when Hollywood stars were expected to smile, pose, and shut up, Jean spoke out. Against the Vietnam War. Against racial injustice. She gave donations to civil rights causes. She aligned herself with the Black Panthers, not out of rebellion, but belief. That was the moment she crossed the line. The line between movie star and threat. And that's when they came for her. The FBI launched a covert operation, COINTELPRO, to discredit her. They tapped her phones. followed her. Leaked false stories to the press, including one that claimed she was pregnant with a Black Panther leader's child. Jean, already pregnant at the time, was crushed. She went into early labor. The baby, Nina, died 2 days later. It wasn't just her image they tried to destroy. It was her soul. In the months that followed, Jean's career faded. Roles disappeared. So did friends. Hollywood, and parts of Europe, turned cold. She and Gary divorced. Her health declined. She tried to remarry director Dennis Barry, but by then, the light in her eyes had dimmed. Even Brando, who once playfully asked her to renew her teenage invitation to Iowa, had drifted away. She had reinvented herself so many times, there was barely anything left of the girl from Marshalltown. Jean Seberg wasn't a mask wearer. She was a mirror, reflecting whatever world she was placed in. Iowa. Hollywood. Paris. Each one saw what they wanted. None saw her completely. And by the end, neither did she. The cameras still flashed. The invitations still came. Film festivals, charity galas, interviews in rooms that smelled like cigarette smoke and watered-down perfume. On paper, Jean Seberg was still luminous. She had worked with Goddard, Preminger, and Rawson. She had starred in over 30 films, moved between languages like silk between fingers, and become an icon of 2 continents. But behind the lens, the frame was cracking. Her peak didn't arrive with fanfare. It crept in quietly, in the form of exhaustion, betrayal, and a growing sense that the fame she fought for was devouring her. In Lilith, 1964, her portrayal of a woman slipping into madness was so eerily authentic that it scared her co-stars. One later admitted, "I couldn't tell where the character ended and Jean began." For Seberg, it was a kind of therapy, an exorcism of the voices that had begun to stir in her own head. But therapy without healing is just repetition. In the years that followed, the roles became more hollow, the shoots more distant. Her public face, once lit with sly charm, hardened into something unreadable. She could still captivate a camera, but her soul no longer played along. Off-screen, her marriage to Romain Gary was falling apart. What had once been intellectual companionship and shared defiance dissolved into cold silences and bitter accusations. Gary, a literary giant with his own shadows, didn't know how to hold her grief. She didn't know how to ask for help. They shared a son, Diego, but not a language anymore. When Jean became involved with Black liberation movements in the late 1960s, it wasn't a publicity stunt. It wasn't rebellion. It was belief. She donated money. She used her platform. She cared, in the way only someone who has been wounded by injustice can care. And for that, the United States government decided she was dangerous. COINTELPRO, the FBI's covert program, made her a target. They didn't just follow her. They stalked her. They didn't just investigate her. They sabotaged her. False rumors were planted in the press. One claimed that her unborn child was fathered by a Black Panther leader. In truth, the baby's father was a man named Carlos Navarra, not even a Panther. But damage doesn't wait for facts. Jean collapsed under the weight of that lie. Already fragile from years of insomnia and pressure, she went into premature labor. Her daughter, Nina Hart Gary, was born 2 months early, and died just 2 days later. Jean had overdosed on sleeping pills during her pregnancy. Some say it was intentional. Some say it wasn't. Jean never confirmed either. She never recovered. From that moment on, she lived in fragments. Her face became gaunt. Her smile, forced. Her voice, softer, like someone apologizing for taking up too much space. Interviews became minefields. She refused questions about politics. Refused to explain herself. Refused to give the press what they craved, a breakdown. But the breakdown came anyway. She lost parts, producers didn't want controversy. She lost friends, no one wanted to be next. She lost countries, the US made her an exile, France turned her into a curiosity. In 1970, she attempted suicide in Rome. It wouldn't be her last attempt. Jean remarried, this time to filmmaker Dennis Barry. But it was less a union than a soft place to land. She drifted in and out of hospital rooms. She lived in small apartments with peeling paint. She dyed her hair. Changed her number. But peace was elusive. Fame had left her with no privacy. Politics had taken her safety. Grief had stolen her sense of self. She still acted, a few minor roles in the 70s, but the spark was gone. No more press tours. No more covers. She had become a relic of a time no one wanted to remember. In one of her last interviews, when asked what advice she'd give her younger self, she simply said, "Don't confuse being seen with being loved." In August 1979, Jean Seberg vanished for days. Friends reported her missing. Her husband assumed she had taken off again, as she sometimes did. But on September 8, her body was found in the back seat of her car in a Paris side street. The vehicle had been parked for over a week. Her corpse was decomposed. Her clothes soaked in sweat. A suicide note clutched in her hand, addressed vaguely. Pills scattered across the seat like broken promises. Police ruled it suicide. The world nodded politely. But those who knew her, truly knew her, never accepted that answer. Some believed the FBI drove her to madness. Others believed she had simply lost the will to fight. Some whispered darker theories, foul play, staged death, silencing. But perhaps the truth is more tragic than any theory. Jean Seberg died the way she lived. Misunderstood, misreported, and missing from the narrative written by others. They buried her with little fanfare. A few close friends, a few family members. The man who had once shared a screen with her, Jean-Paul Belmondo, was the only former co-star to attend. The newspapers wrote obituaries lined with passive regret, gone too soon. A troubled icon. A fading star. But none of them really asked why. Jean Seberg's story didn't end in that car. It ended in the silence that followed, the kind the world uses to erase inconvenient women. Not scandalous women. Not broken women. But women who dared to be more than decoration. Who dared to believe. Who dared to speak. Her name was scrubbed from Hollywood memory, her films archived but rarely revisited, her legacy tangled in the politics of the time. For decades, she was reduced to a cautionary tale, whispered in film schools, cited in FBI reports, remembered vaguely in retrospectives. But she never truly disappeared. In recent years, her story has resurfaced, not as a tragedy, but as a reckoning. A woman crushed by systems larger than herself. A muse weaponized by power. A rebel disguised as an ingenue. Jean Seberg didn't vanish. She became a warning. A voice beneath the celluloid. A memory in flickering black and white, refusing to go quietly. And now, when we watch her on screen, smiling, speaking, smoking in soft light, we see more than a role. We see a woman asking, even now, will you finally see me?